A Miss Marple mystery fan fiction, original story, inspired by the works of Dame Agatha Christie. Much Benham, England, October 1935. Chapter 1. The Smell of Wood Smoke and Something Else. The 4:17 from Paddington arrived at Chadwick Halt precisely 4 minutes late, which Miss Jane Marple considered entirely acceptable for a Thursday in October. She descended the 2 steps onto the narrow platform with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned after a certain age that haste was the enemy of dignity, and steadied herself with her black umbrella against the sharp October wind that came sweeping across the common with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting all summer for permission. Much Benham was not a village, one found on maps of consequence. It lay 3 miles east of Chadwick Halt, by a road that wound considerably more than necessary through common land, and past 2 ancient stiles, and alongside a brook that was perfectly lovely in May, and perfectly treacherous in November. It was the sort of village, Miss Marple thought as the hired motor rattled and complained along the lane, that existed primarily to provide itself with something to talk about, and had been doing so, she suspected, since well before the reign of the first Elizabeth. The trees on either side of the lane had gone to copper and deep gold. The hedgerows were threaded with old man's beard, and the last of the autumn berries, dark red and precise as stitches on a sampler. Everything smelled of leaf mold and cold, and the distant, comfortable suggestion of coal fires. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the kind of English autumn afternoon that made one feel the world was in its correct order, which was usually a reliable indication that it was not. She had not been to Much Benham in 11 years. The last occasion had been a summer tea party at the vicarage, given by the previous incumbent's wife, a pleasant but rather empty woman who had oversweetened the scones and underestimated how much one noticed about a household in an afternoon. The current vicar's wife, Mrs. Euphemia Trent, was a different creature entirely. She had written to Miss Marple in September with characteristic directness. "Dear Jane, the autumn here is exceptional this year, and I am quite certain the air would benefit your chest. The harvest supper is on the 14th. Gerald Fossick has been made churchwarden, which is either very funny or very worrying. I cannot decide which. Do come and help me decide. Euphemia." Miss Marple had decided to come. She was not, in truth, particularly concerned about her chest. She had one of those constitutions that appeared fragile, and was not like certain very old country houses that looked as though they ought to be condemned and proved, on inspection, to have walls 3 feet thick. But she was very interested, in that quiet and particular way of hers, in a man who could be described simultaneously as funny and worrying. In her experience, such men were rarely either, and generally something considerably more dangerous than both. The motor deposited her at the vicarage gate at 5:30, and Euphemia Trent came hurrying down the path in a brown wool coat that had seen better decades, her gray hair escaping its pins in 3 separate places, and her expression exactly what it always was: alert, affectionate, and faintly worried. The expression of an intelligent woman who has spent 30 years in a role that does not quite contain her. "Jane, you look wonderfully well. Come in immediately. It is going to rain within the hour." The vicarage smelled of wood smoke, boot polish, and something else, something faintly acrid that Miss Marple's nose catalogued without comment, the way she catalogued everything, quietly, precisely, without attribution until attribution was warranted. Chemical, almost. Not unpleasant, exactly. or but out of place in a vicarage drawing-room that otherwise smelled entirely of the 19th century, of old books and dried lavender, and the particular institutional comfort of coal fires and cold draughts. "Your fire is giving trouble?" Miss Marple asked, settling into the armchair nearest the hearth and unwinding her scarf, with the unhurried movements of someone who has learned to install herself in a room as though she has always been there. Euphemia looked momentarily startled. She had always been startled by Jane, even after all these years, in that particular way that people are startled by something they knew was coming and were not prepared for, regardless. "No, it is perfectly fine. That odd smell, it is Mr. Fossick, actually. He came by this afternoon about the arrangements for the supper, and he brought his little medicine bottles, several of them, in a small leather case. He is very particular about his medicines. Digestive trouble, he says, though I think it is mostly anxiety, dressed up as indigestion. Anxiety that he will not be needed, perhaps." She paused, straightening an antimacassar that did not require straightening. "He is not a comfortable man, Jane. Tell me about him," said Miss Marple pleasantly, and accepted the cup of tea that appeared from somewhere behind her. Euphemia sat down opposite and considered. She was a precise woman when precision was called for, a woman who did not deal in approximations when the exact would serve. Gerald Fossick has been the village solicitor here for 22 years. He was brought in from outside, from some firm in Worcester, and he has never quite allowed the village to forget that he came from something larger. He is 57, a widower of 8 years, no children of his own. He has a nephew, Oliver Tash, his late wife's nephew, technically, who visits occasionally, and who is, I think, rather desperately in need of money. Fossick is not a generous man. His clients respect him. His clients fear him, which is not the same thing at all. Euphemia's voice was careful, precise. He knows things, Jane. A solicitor always does. All those wills and deeds and little private arrangements that families make, and then spend the next 20 years hoping nobody will examine too closely. But Fossick has a way of letting you know that he knows. Never directly. Never anything you could put a finger on. Just a certain look, a certain way of pausing before he speaks, as though he is considering what it would cost you if he said more. She set down her teacup. Last spring he rewrote Mrs. Alderman Copley's will, changed it considerably, from what I understand. She died in June. She was 81, and quite comfortable with the idea of dying by the end. But her family were not comfortable at all with what they found when the will was read. "Which family?" asked Miss Marple, with the air of someone inquiring after distant acquaintances, rather than the first thread of something considerably more knotted. "The Copleys, primarily. 3 cousins, Harold, Maud, and a younger one, Robert, who had expected rather more than they received. But also a girl named Cecily Marsh, who teaches at the village school, and who received absolutely nothing, though several people in the village had assumed she would be remembered." Euphemia hesitated. "There are stories about Cecily Marsh, Jane. Old stories, or rather, the stories themselves are new, but they seem to connect to something very old indeed." Miss Marple made a sound of gentle and entirely genuine inquiry. "Her mother," said Euphemia quietly, "was a girl called Violet Alderton. She left Much Benham in 1903 under circumstances that were not discussed in polite company, and have not been discussed to any useful purpose since. She was in trouble. The father of the child was never named publicly. Cecily arrived in the village 6 months ago, and says very little about herself, and a great deal about the autumn term curriculum, which is, I think, deliberate. She looked at Miss Marple steadily. She resembles someone. I have been trying to remember who, and it keeps almost coming to me in the way that a word does, hovering just at the edge. The rain arrived then, pressing against the vicarage windows with October's particular insistence, and the fire spoke quietly to itself. And somewhere in the village, in its locked offices, and its old stone houses, and its long memories, a great many things were pressing against their surfaces in just the same way, awaiting the particular kind of opening that Miss Marple, without intending to, had a remarkable habit of providing. She slept well that night, as she always did before something interesting. She had found, over a long life of interesting things, that the body was wiser than the mind in this regard. It rested when rest was still available, knowing what was coming. Chapter 2. The village assembles. The morning of the harvest supper dawned with the particular cold clarity that October reserves for its very finest days. A sky of pale, hard blue, swept absolutely clean of cloud, the kind of sky that makes everything below it look freshly cut and over-bright. The trees along the lane had gone to copper and deep gold, and a certain exhausted amber that Miss Marple always thought of as the color of a thing that has given everything it has, and is content to have done so. She walked out after breakfast with her umbrella and her good wool coat, and made her slow, observant way through the village. She had a gift. She had always possessed it. From girlhood, for being entirely unremarkable. She was a small, elderly lady, with white hair and faded blue eyes, and an expression of mild, vague interest in everything, and people said things near her that they would never have said near a person who appeared to be listening. She had found this invaluable over a long life. People would say almost anything, she had discovered, if they were sufficiently convinced that nobody of consequence was hearing it. The village shop was her first port of call, which was also the post office, a function performed by Mrs. Dorothea Plum, a large, smooth-faced woman of 60, who stood behind her counter with the settled authority of someone who has occupied a strategic position for a very long time, and intends to remain in it until either the position or she ceased to exist. The post office counter of an English village, Miss Marple had long ago observed, was to gossip what a watershed was to rivers. Everything eventually flowed through it, in one direction or another, and Mrs. Plum had the look of a woman who drank deeply and remembered everything. Miss Marple, is it not? From St. Mary Mead. Yes, Mrs. Trent mentioned you'd be visiting. Mrs. Plum's eyes were small and very bright, like a robin's, a bird that appears friendly and is, in fact, furiously territorial. They moved constantly, cataloguing. We are all looking forward to the supper tonight. Mr. Fossick has taken charge of the decorations this year, which is unexpected for a man of his particular temperament. He is an artistic man? Miss Marple asked, examining a jar of local honey with what appeared to be deep and exclusive interest. He is a man who likes to be seen doing things, said Mrs. Plum, with the precision of someone who has been waiting for the question and has prepared the answer carefully. There is a difference between doing things and being seen doing them, and Fossick has always understood which side of it he prefers. She paused, and the bright eyes were very still for a moment. He positioned himself rather carefully regarding Mrs. Copley's affairs, too. One might almost say he arranged things. I understood she was a client of his for many years, 20 at least, and rewarded him accordingly in her will, or so it would appear, since he was the one who drew it up, which some people find an irregular arrangement, though I am not qualified to say. She smiled without warmth. The Copley cousins have retained a solicitor in Chadwick to examine the document professionally. Harold Copley told me last week that he intends to get to the bottom of it, which, knowing Harold, may mean anything from a strongly worded letter to genuine legal action. Miss Marple purchased the honey and 2 postcards of the Norman church tower and went out into the bright October morning, carrying everything she had heard in the careful receptacle of her mind, where things were stored in particular order, and retrieved when needed, like cards in a well-maintained index. She found the village school at the far end of the lane, a low stone building behind an iron railing with a gate that needed oiling. School was in session. She could hear the unified drone of children reciting their times tables through the single large window, the rhythm of it as regular and persistent as a woodpecker. At the gate she paused, as elderly ladies pause, unremarkably, unthreateningly, and looked in. Through the glass she could see the school teacher standing at the blackboard, a young woman, pale, with dark hair, pulled back severely, in a style that was several years behind the current fashion, and suggested either indifference or the deliberate avoidance of attracting attention. She stood very straight, as though straightness were something she had decided upon and maintained by an act of continuous will. Her hands moved at the blackboard with the absorbed, efficient movements of someone who has found in work the thing that keeps them from thinking about other things. Miss Marple looked at her for quite a long time. Then she walked on. The church occupied the highest ground in the village. They usually did, the old ones, as though the builders had understood instinctively that proximity to God was a matter of altitude. It was a Norman tower with a Victorian restoration that had been conducted with more enthusiasm than sensitivity, and the churchyard around it was beautifully maintained, the grass close cut, the graves tended, the old stone walls free of the encroaching ivy that would have been the natural consequence of neglect. She found Reverend Trent in the far corner of the yard, engaged in the removal of a bramble, with considerably more force than the task strictly required. He was a gentle, rather anxious man of 55, with very large hands, iron-rimmed spectacles, and a perpetual slight frown that was not displeasure but concentration, the frown of a man who takes everything seriously and finds the world offers an unmanageable amount of material. "Ah, Miss Marple, good morning. Euphemia will be very pleased you came. She has been. The autumn is exceptional this year, I think. Very clear. Very fine." He had the characteristic speech of a very honest man in a delicate position, beginning sentences with confidence and redirecting them when they threatened to arrive somewhere awkward. Miss Marple found this entirely endearing. "Your churchyard is beautifully kept," she said, which was both true and an invitation. "Yes, we are very grateful. The east wall. The maintenance has been funded by the Copley family for well over a century. An arrangement made in the 1820s with the then incumbent. Binding in its way, though not. Things are uncertain at present regarding the family's circumstances. The estate is in some dispute." He picked up the bramble with his large hands and deposited it in the wheelbarrow with unnecessary thoroughness. "Fossick is the churchwarden. It would be inappropriate for me to say more about it than that." "I never repeat things," said Miss Marple, which was entirely true, though it did not mean she did not use them. Reverend Trent looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment, the look of a man calculating the gap between what he ought to say and what he actually wants to say, and finding it narrower than Christian discretion recommends. Then he seemed to reach a conclusion. He altered Mrs. Copley's will, changed it considerably from the version she had signed 3 years before. He presented it as a revision she had requested, and perhaps she did request it. She was very old and very tired by then, and there were days when she would have agreed to anything simply to be left in peace. But the changes benefited Fossick directly, and the family, and others who had expected to be remembered, were left with considerably less than they had understood to be coming to them. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them vigorously, which Miss Marple recognized as a displacement activity. I am attempting to maintain Christian charity toward Gerald Fossick, and finding it, I will be honest, a considerable spiritual exercise. Miss Marple walked back to the vicarage in a state of quiet and particular attention. She was thinking about several things at once, about Mrs. Copley's will, about the acrid smell in the vicarage drawing-room the previous evening, about a pale young woman standing very straight at a blackboard, and about a girl named Violet Alderton, who had left this village in disgrace in 1903, and whose daughter had now, quietly and purposefully, returned. She was also, at the back of her mind, thinking about a solicitor named Mr. Broderick in St. Mary Mead, who had died at a dinner party many years ago, of what his doctor had called cardiac arrest. Nobody had thought much of it at the time, because Broderick had been 59 and somewhat overweight, and it was the sort of thing that happened to men of 59 who were somewhat overweight at dinner parties. Miss Marple had thought rather a lot of it. She had thought about it for several years, in fact, before the matter had been quietly resolved by other means. She thought about it again now, as she walked under the copper-gold trees, and the October wind moved through the churchyard behind her, and in the village hall the preparations for the harvest supper continued, with the cheerful, unseeing momentum of a thing whose surface gives no indication of what is happening underneath it. Chapter 3. Elderflower and Other Matters. The village hall of Much Benham had been built in 1887 to commemorate the Queen's Golden Jubilee, and it bore this origin with the grim confidence of Victorian civic architecture. Walls of pale limestone 3 feet thick, windows set too high to admit comfortable light, a floor of tongue and groove pine that amplified every footstep into a small announcement, and a ceiling from which hung 3 pendant lights that succeeded in illuminating the room without noticeably brightening it. By 7 o'clock on the evening of October the 14th, it had been transformed, or the attempt at transformation had been made, with paper lanterns and amber and gold strung between the beams, and wreaths of autumn leaves fixed with wire above the door and windows, and trestle tables covered in white linen running the length of the hall. It smelled powerfully of roasted meats, potato, and leek soup, fresh bread, and underneath all of these honest smells, something sweeter and more particular, the elderflower cordial that Mrs. Plum's Women's Institute had been pressing and bottling since August, dozens of tall glass bottles of it, pale gold and scented, and arranged with proprietary satisfaction along a side table. Miss Marple arrived with the Trents at 5 minutes past 7, and took up a position near the end of the second trestle table, a position she had selected from the doorway in the 3 seconds before she moved toward it, which offered the most comprehensive view of the hall the serving table, the side door to the passage, and the corridor leading to the back pantry. She accepted a glass of cordial, which she did not drink, and applied herself to looking pleasant and unobservant. The village was all there. She catalogued it as she stood. The Copley cousins arranged themselves near the far wall, with the collective expression of people attending a reading of a will they expect to be unpleasant. Harold, the eldest, a large, red-faced man in his 60s, whose grievance had by now reached the stage of becoming a defining characteristic. Maud, precise and thin-lipped. Robert, the youngest at 40, who looked more watchful than angry, which Miss Marple thought more interesting. Mrs. Plum, stationed behind the cordial table with proprietorial satisfaction, dispensing glasses with the air of someone presiding over a ceremony she has designed. Her blue wool dress was very good. The jet brooch was very good. Everything about Mrs. Plum was very good, Miss Marple observed, in the precise, careful way of a woman who has assembled herself from quality materials and means to be noticed for it. Young Mr. Oliver Tash, the nephew, who was not entirely young, being perhaps 35, with the particular handsomeness of a man who has relied heavily on it, and is beginning to notice that it extends less credit than it once did. He moved through the room with expansive, practiced ease, greeting people he barely knew with the warmth of someone who needs to be liked, and talking continuously, loudly, filling the air around him with sound in the way that people do when silence makes them nervous. He wore a suit that was very nearly right. And Mr. Gerald Fossick himself, standing near the door, holding a glass of cordial, and receiving the various villagers with the manner of a man who is in charge of something, not the supper, particularly, but of them generally. He was a compact, well-dressed man of 57, with iron-gray hair cut close, a gray suit of excellent quality, and a face that had once been handsome, and had settled, over the decades, into something harder and more durable. Authority, one might say, rather than handsomeness. The authority of a man who has things over people, and knows it, and has learned to wear that knowledge the way he wore his suit, correctly, with care, and as though it were entirely natural. His eyes moved with the same constant cataloguing motion as Mrs. Plum's, but where hers were a robin's, bright, acquisitive, and territorial, his were something cooler and more patient, a hawk, perhaps. A hawk that has learned that patience, in the end, brings better results than speed. At the far end of the hall, near the high window, Miss Cecily Marsh sat alone with a plate of food she was not eating, watching the room with eyes that seemed both present and elsewhere. The eyes of someone whose body is in the room and whose mind is conducting a separate, parallel activity that it finds considerably more urgent. Miss Marple observed all of this over 20 minutes, moving when she moved with the vague, unhurried drift of an elderly woman, looking for somewhere comfortable to stand. Then she went and sat beside Cecily Marsh. "The decorations are rather charming," she said. "Mr. Fossick's work, I'm told." The girl turned, and Miss Marple, in the manner she had when things aligned, saw several things in the same instant. The dark hair, the particular clean angle of the jaw, and the eyes, not dark as one might have expected from the coloring, but a remarkable shade of gray-green, unusual, sea-colored, the color of certain old harbor waters on certain kinds of day. "He does like to be useful," said Cecily Marsh. Her voice was quiet and controlled, a classroom voice, accustomed to making itself clearly heard without being raised. "You don't care for him," said Miss Marple pleasantly, without emphasis. A pause, measured, considered. He managed Mrs. Copley's affairs. I had hoped she had spoken of. She stopped. "It is of no consequence now, I think. Mrs. Copley was fond of you, I think. She was kind to me. She had known my mother." The gray-green eyes came to rest on Miss Marple's face with an expression that was half wariness and half something that might, given encouragement, become relief. The expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has begun to wonder whether that was the correct decision. "You are from St. Mary Mead. People here have mentioned your name in a certain way." "I am a very ordinary person," said Miss Marple, "who has found that villages are all, in their essentials, the same." Cecily Marsh said nothing for a moment, looking at her carefully. Then, "She promised me something. Before she was very ill, she said there was a letter that had been held for many years, that she would see I received it. She was quite clear about it. And you did not receive it." "No." Her hands were very still in her lap, a stillness that was not calm, but its opposite, the stillness of something under considerable pressure. "Mr. Fossick administered her estate entirely. There was no letter, he said, no instructions regarding me. He was very smooth about it, very professional, very sorry." Across the room, Oliver Tash made a loud joke about the cordial, and whether anyone had thought to add something to improve it. Several people laughed, with the particular relief of people who want to laugh at something. Gerald Fossick smiled, a faint, comfortable smile. The smile of a man at ease with the way things are, because the way things are suits him. It was at 8:30 precisely. Miss Marple had noted the time on the wall clock, that Robert Copley, the youngest cousin, went to the back pantry to fetch another crate of cordial bottles, tried the door, found it locked, knocked with increasing urgency over the course of 3 minutes, and then fetched the passkey from the hook in the passage corridor. What he found was described in the subsequent 20 minutes with varying degrees of accuracy by the 15 or so people who crowded in to look. Gerald Fossick, seated with his back against the wall, below the lower shelving, quite still, a glass of cordial beside him on the stone flags, his eyes half open, his face bearing the particular waxy relaxation of a man from whom tension has departed permanently. Dr. Hargreaves arrived in 12 minutes. He lived on the far side of the village common, and pronounced with suitable gravity that death appeared to have resulted from cardiac arrest, that Mr. Fossick was known to have a heart condition, that there was nothing immediately to suggest otherwise, and that the coroner would be notified in the morning as a matter of procedure. The village believed him. It wished to believe him. It breathed an almost audible sigh of relief, the relief of a community that has lived for 20 years under a particular weight and felt it lift. Miss Marple did not breathe a sigh of relief. She stood where she was, near the window where Cecily Marsh had sat, and she observed what could be observed from that position. And she noticed 3 things. The cordial glass on the stone floor had been wiped. It sat with the absolute transparency of a glass that has been cleaned with great care and thoroughness. Not a smear, not a fingerprint, not the cloudy breath mark of someone who had simply set it down. A glass set down by a dying man does not wipe itself. The key to the pantry door, laid by Dr. Hargreaves on the side table in the passage, smelled distinctly, unmistakably, of lavender oil. Not the dried flower lavender of old sachets and elderly dressing tables, but a sharp, clean, penetrating lavender oil. the medicinal kind, used to lubricate and preserve metal fittings. And Oliver Tash, who had been loudly, expansively, unmistakably present everywhere in the hall for the entire evening, could not be accounted for by anyone for the period between 8:15 and 8:25. 10 minutes, precisely. 10 minutes was enough. Miss Marple went home to the vicarage and drank a small glass of warm milk. She thought very carefully, in the particular focused way she had, for rather a long time. Then she slept. She always found that problems clarified significantly during sleep, when the conscious mind was not obstructing the process. Chapter 4. Knitting and Inquiry. Miss Marple spent the following morning in Euphemia Trent's sitting room with her knitting, a pale blue bed jacket for her niece's birthday that had been progressing for some weeks at the pace of events, and received visitors. Not formally, of course. She never did anything formally, and formality would have destroyed the thing entirely. She simply sat by the fire and knitted, and was elderly and entirely unthreatening. And people came in and out in connection with the aftermath of the supper. Returned dishes, borrowed chairs, the general domestic circulation of a village recollecting itself after a communal event. And they talked, as people do when there is something significant to talk about, because the alternative to talking about it is simply thinking about it, and thinking about it alone is considerably less comfortable. Mrs. Plum arrived first, on the pretext of returning a large serving dish that she had borrowed from the vicarage kitchen 2 days previously, and could perfectly well have returned tomorrow. She came in, carrying the dish with both hands, and wearing the expression of civic sorrow she had clearly been perfecting since the previous evening. "Poor Gerald," she said, with the intonation of a woman who has waited many years to say those words and intends to say them to everyone available. His heart. Of course, we all knew, those who paid attention, that his heart was not strong. He carried too much, that was his trouble. The affairs of too many people, too many responsibilities. A man can only bear so much. He must have been quite indispensable to the village, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Plum's expression rearranged itself into something considerably more textured. Indispensable. Yes, that is the word. He knew everything, of course. A village solicitor of his tenure always does. Wills, deeds, the private arrangements of decades. He held papers for perhaps half the families in the district. She set down the serving dish on the sideboard with unnecessary care, her back briefly toward Miss Marple. I find myself wondering what will happen to it all. His files, his office documents. One hopes these things are handled with appropriate discretion in the transfer to his partner. His partner in Chadwick? Mr. Downs. A different sort entirely. Younger, or less, experienced in the particular texture of village life. Less aware of the context in which certain documents exist. She turned back, and her expression was perfectly smooth again, as smooth as it always was. Gerald understood context. It was, perhaps, his greatest professional quality. After Mrs. Plum came Oliver Tash, which surprised Miss Marple. She had not precisely expected him to seek her out, though she had thought it possible. He came with the restless, a slightly disheveled energy of a man who has not slept adequately and is covering the deficiency with movement. His jacket not quite straight, his smile arriving a fraction of a second too late to be entirely natural. "Mrs. Trent mentioned you were here. I hope you don't mind. I am not entirely certain what I wanted, actually. You seemed calm last night. and I was not calm at all, and I think I simply wanted to be near someone calm. He sat down without being invited, which Miss Marple noted without expression. It was the action of a man accustomed to taking up space wherever he found himself. Gerald was not, we were not close, I want to be honest about that. He was my late aunt's family connection, not genuinely mine. But he had agreed to assist me with certain financial arrangements, against my future expectations from the estate. He had promised, and now he is dead, and I do not know what happens to a promise when the man who made it is dead, legally speaking, whether it exists in writing, whether it exists at all. He looked at his hands. I find myself in a position of considerable uncertainty. That must be very worrying, said Miss Marple. The thing is, he looked up. I had documents with him, personal documents. He was holding them. I want to make certain they are returned to me rather than examined by people who have no cause to examine them. He stopped. You are very quiet. I am knitting, said Miss Marple. Right. Yes. He stood, straightening his jacket. I am sorry to have bothered you. It was foolish to come. He left with the speed of a man who has said more than he intended and is conducting a rapid retreat. After he had gone, the room was quiet for a moment except for the fire and the click of the needles. Then Euphemia Trent, who had been sitting in the corner chair throughout with the still attentiveness of a woman performing the difficult act of not being noticed, said quietly, "Whose documents, do you think? His own or Fossick's?" "Both, I should think," said Miss Marple, "which is why the question matters so much." She knitted in silence for a moment. "Euphemia, you said yesterday that Cecily Marsh reminded you of someone, and that it was almost coming to you. Has it come?" Euphemia was quiet for slightly too long. "Yes," she said at last. "This morning, while I was making the porridge. It came to me quite suddenly, the way these things do when you have stopped pushing." She looked at the fire. "She has the Fossick eyes. Gerald's wife had them. That particular gray-green, that unusual color. I have never seen it in anyone except the Fossick family. It is striking, once you see it." Miss Marple's knitting needles stopped. "Gerald Fossick's wife's family," she said very carefully, "or Gerald Fossick's own family. His father's family, perhaps?" Euphemia turned from the fire and looked at her. "Jane, are you saying—" "I am not saying anything yet," said Miss Marple. "I am, however, thinking quite seriously about writing a note to Dr. Hargreaves, and I think, if it is possible to arrange, I should like to speak with Cecily Marsh this afternoon." Chapter 5. The Letter and the Key. Cecily Marsh came to the vicarage at 4 o'clock, in response to a note delivered by Reverend Trent on his afternoon rounds of the parish. She came carefully, that was the word for it, Miss Marple thought, watching her come up the vicarage path through the sitting-room window, with the careful walk of someone who has been careful for so long that it has become the natural mode of movement. Her coat was buttoned all the way to the throat, despite the fact that the sitting-room was warm. The buttons were a kind of armor. Miss Marple poured the tea before she said anything, and passed the cup, and waited for the girl to settle, which she did only partially, remaining very straight in the chair, both feet flat on the floor, as though she might need to stand quickly. "You know something about what happened," said Miss Marple. "You have known since last night, I think, and you have been deciding whether to tell anyone. I want you to tell me, if you will, because I believe the situation is rather more serious than you may have allowed yourself to consider." The gray-green eyes looked at her with an expression she had seen before. Many times, the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has been found out by the carrying and is now calculating whether being found out might, possibly, lead to relief rather than punishment. "Mrs. Copley," Cecily began. She stopped, reorganized. She was my grandmother's closest friend. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was Violet Alderton. "I know," said Miss Marple quietly. "She left this village in 1903. She was 17 years old. There was a child coming, and no prospect of marriage, because the man responsible, refused to acknowledge it, and his family arranged for her to be removed." She said it flatly, with the flatness of someone who has rehearsed the fact until it has ceased to be anything other than a fact. "She went to her mother's sister in Shropshire. My mother was born there. Violet never came back to Much Benham, but she wrote to Mrs. Copley for 30 years because Mrs. Copley, who was a girl of 19 in 1903 and had been Violet's dearest friend, wrote to her first and kept writing and never stopped. And Mrs. Copley kept those letters. She kept everything." A pause. 6 months before she died, when she was still well enough to manage her own affairs, before Gerald Fossick had what I now understand was almost complete control over her daily life, she gave me something. She reached into her coat and produced an envelope. It was old. The paper yellowed. The ink faded almost to brown, sealed with wax that had been broken once and pressed imperfectly closed again. She said, "If anything happens regarding the estate, if you are left with nothing, if Fossick," she was very specific about Fossick, Jane, "take this to a solicitor in London, not in the county, not him, and not anyone he knows." Miss Marple looked at the envelope without touching it. "What does it contain?" "A letter from my grandmother to Mrs. Copley, written in the spring of 1903, before she left Much Benham. It names the man responsible for her condition, and it refers to certain other matters: money that changed hands, promises given and broken, arrangements made by the man's father through his position as solicitor to several of the local families." She set down the envelope on the table between them, not relinquishing it exactly, but no longer entirely holding it. "The man named in the letter has been dead for 30 years, but his son inherited everything, including, apparently, the knowledge of what his father had done, and how that knowledge might be used." Gerald Fossick knew the letter existed. I believe he suspected. When I first arrived in Much Benham, he came to see me twice in my first week, before I had so much as met anyone else. Very attentive, very smooth, very interested in my family history. He asked about my mother, about any family correspondence I might have kept, whether my grandmother had left papers of any kind. I said I didn't know of any, which was technically true at the time. Mrs. Copley had not yet given it to me. He had already changed the will by then. I believe he had been changing it for some time, incrementally. Mrs. Copley was 80 years old and tired, and trusted him completely. He had been her solicitor for 20 years. The gray-green eyes were very steady. When she died, and there was nothing for me, nothing at all, I understood what had happened. He had taken what she intended for me: the post office building that was to go to Mrs. Plum, the small bequest to the church. He had rearranged everything. "The pantry key," said Miss Marple. A silence of several seconds, the silence of someone deciding. "I went in there during the afternoon," said Cecily, with the decorating committee carrying lanterns. I noted the position of the cordial bottles, the store arrangements. Another pause. And then, during the evening, I had made a decision. I was going to confront him. I know it was foolish. I was going to show him the letter and tell him I was taking it to London the following week, and that nothing he could do or say would prevent me. I wanted him to know. I wanted to see his face. You went to the pantry. He was not there. I waited 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard voices in the passage, and I left and locked the door with the key from the hook. And yes, I have lavender oil on my hands constantly. I use it for the schoolroom lock, which sticks in cold weather. And I went back to the hall. She met Miss Marple's eyes. 20 minutes later, Robert Copley found him. "You did not kill him," said Miss Marple. Not entirely a question, but not entirely a statement either. "No," said Cecily Marsh. "I did not." Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment, reading what was there with the calm expertise of long practice. Then she picked up her knitting. "No," she said, "I didn't think you had. But someone else went to that pantry, and that someone knew considerably more about Gerald Fossick's daily habits and medical situation than the average resident of this village." She paused. "Your classroom? Is it near the chemist's shop?" Cecily looked surprised. "2 doors down. I pass it twice a day." "In the past several weeks, have you noticed anything particular about Mr. Fossick's visits there? The frequency, perhaps? Or whether he collected his own prescriptions or sent someone?" Cecily thought. He always collected them himself. He was very private about that sort of thing. She paused. "But about 6 weeks ago, I remember it because it was a Monday and I was late. There was a delivery van outside the chemist's. Not the usual pharmaceutical lorry. A private carrier, and Fossick signed for the package himself, which was unusual. He looked at me when he turned around, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't read. Satisfaction, perhaps. Or anticipation." Miss Marple knitted 3 rows in silence. Then she said very quietly, "I think I know what he was going to do with it. And I think I know who reached the pantry before him and did it first." Chapter 6. The Shape of Old Sins. What Miss Marple did next was not, on its surface, investigation. It was tea. Specifically, she went to take tea with Mrs. Dorothea Plum in the back room behind the post-office counter. A room she had been invited into with a warmth that was, Miss Marple thought, slightly too immediate, slightly too ready. The warmth of someone who has been expecting an approach and has prepared for it. The room smelled of paraffin and the faint institutional smell of sorted mail, a smell that Miss Marple had always associated, pleasantly, with the particular quality of information that post offices hold, the shape of other people's correspondence, the weight of their expectations. They sat with their teacups and seed cake in the careful comfort of 2 women of similar age, engaged in the elaborate performance of an ordinary conversation. And Miss Marple listened, and within 45 minutes she had the following. Oliver Tash had debts of a specific and pressing kind, the kind that arrive in certain envelopes with certain postmarks. Mrs. Plum had noted these postmarks over the past 8 months. 2 came from a firm in London that dealt in what she called that sort of lending. 1 came from a private address in Bath that had the character of something personal and financial simultaneously. None of them had been answered, as far as she could determine from the returned mail patterns, which told its own story. Gerald Fossick had sent and received an unusual volume of correspondence in September and October, more than was usual for this time of year, when village legal business was at its quietest. Several letters to an address in Birmingham, several letters to an address in London that Mrs. Plum described, with careful neutrality, as a pharmaceutical register, and a package. She remembered it precisely, as she remembered everything, had arrived 6 weeks previously from a firm of pharmaceutical supply in Birmingham addressed to Fossick personally. He had signed for it himself and taken it away immediately, which was unusual. His secretary normally handled packages. A pharmaceutical firm, said Miss Marple. Medical supplies, it stated on the label. Though he was not a medical man, of course. Mrs. Plum refilled the teacups. He was very particular about his own medicines. Always had been. Dr. Hargreaves prescribed for him naturally. But a man who is very particular about medicines sometimes finds that what is prescribed is insufficient for what he has in mind. Miss Marple looked at her over the teacup with her faded blue eyes, and Mrs. Plum looked back, and for just a moment something passed between them. Something that was not a statement and not a question, and was, in its way, a recognition. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple stopped at the chemist's shop under the pretext of purchasing aspirin. Mr. Harlow, not the usual Alderton who had retired, but a younger man, quite knowledgeable, was behind the counter, and Miss Marple spent 14 minutes discussing the management of old property in cold weather, the difficulty of damp in stone buildings, and the various treatments available for wood and stonework. In the course of this, she learned that Gerald Fossick had purchased, over the past 3 months, a compound used primarily for pest control, which could also, in certain preparations, or at certain concentrations, affect human cardiac function in ways that would not, in a man with a known heart condition, present as suspicious to a general practitioner. He had also been collecting, on prescription, a standard digitalis preparation. Digitalis, Miss Marple reflected as she walked back along the October lane, the trees very brilliant now in the afternoon light, the shadows long and cold, was a compound used to regulate the heart. In therapeutic doses it kept hearts like Gerald Fossick's beating in regular order. In very much higher doses, in the kinds of doses that could be introduced, say, into a glass of elderflower cordial that a man had poured for himself and then briefly set down, it caused the heart to cease its rhythm in a manner that, in a man of 57 with documented cardiac history, would present to any rural doctor as entirely natural. As expected, even. The mechanism was clear. The glass had been wiped by someone who knew, when they wiped it, that there would not be time for the substance to act before Fossick returned to the main hall, and so had planned for him to finish the glass in the pantry, alone, where he went routinely at some point in the evening to check the supplies as churchwarden. Someone who knew his habits, his routines, the unremarkable daily life details of a man that only someone who had watched him carefully and for some time would possess. She was thinking now about motive, and there were several available. The Copley cousins, all 3 of them, and their inheritance. Cecily Marsh, and her mother's history. Oliver Tash, and whatever private arrangement he was now so anxious to recover. Any of them had reason. Not all of them had the particular, precise kind of knowledge required. She turned into the vicarage lane and thought about what Mrs. Plum had said about the pharmaceutical letters, and what she had not said. She thought about the timing of the package from Birmingham. She thought about a woman behind a post-office counter who knows every letter that passes through a village, every postmark, every sender, every weight and shape and character of envelope. For 30 years. For the entire professional life of a man who had used knowledge as his primary instrument. And she thought, this was the thing that had been hovering at the back of her mind since the previous morning. She thought about who had most consistently and most clearly described Fossick's methods, who had given her the phrase that kept returning, a certain pausing, a certain look, letting you know that he knows she had heard that from Euphemia Trent. But before that, she had heard something very similar, in almost identical language, from Mrs. Dorothea Plum, a woman who described a man's methods with such precision either fears them very particularly or has studied them for a very particular reason. Miss Marple went in through the vicarage gate and asked Euphemia to look up, in the old parish registers that the Reverend kept in his study, the maiden name of Mrs. Dorothea Plum. Chapter 7. A Quiet Conversation About Poison. On the morning of October the 16th, Miss Marple wrote 2 notes in the vicarage sitting-room, using the good writing paper from Euphemia's bureau, in her small, regular, entirely legible hand. The first was to Dr. Hargreaves. It was 3 paragraphs long, and was composed with the precision of someone who understands exactly how much information to provide, in order to produce a specific result and not a word more. It mentioned the cordial glass. It mentioned the Birmingham pharmaceutical supplier. It mentioned digitalis and certain related compounds, and the particular way in which their effects might present in a man of Mr. Fossick's age and medical history. It did not name anyone. It simply noted that in the circumstances, a more thorough examination of the situation seemed professionally advisable, and that Dr. Hargreaves, whose reputation in the district was very highly regarded, would no doubt wish to protect that reputation by ensuring all proper procedures had been followed. It was, in Miss Marple's considered opinion, the kind of letter that a doctor could not receive and do nothing with. The second note was an invitation to afternoon tea. She set the table herself at the small table in the window bay of Euphemia's sitting-room, the good china, the silver pot that had been a wedding present, the seed cake from Tuesday, the sandwiches with the crusts removed. She placed the chairs with care, her own nearest the fire, the guest's chair so positioned that the light from the window fell fully on the face of whoever sat in it. She had learned long ago that a face seen in clear light was a considerably more legible document than a face in shadow. Then she sat down and knitted, and the vicarage clock ticked, and the fire settled, and at 3:30 on the afternoon of October the 16th, Mrs. Dorothea Plum came up the vicarage path. She had dressed for it. Miss Marple noticed this with the particular attention she gave to such details. The good blue-wool dress, the jet brooch that was genuinely old and genuinely valuable, the hair freshly pinned with not a strand displaced. She was a woman who understood occasions and did not come to them underprepared. Miss Marple found she respected this. "What a pleasant room," said Mrs. Plum, sitting down and accepting her cup, with the ease of a woman entirely composed. "Such a comfortable house. The vicarage. Euphemia has excellent domestic instincts, hasn't she?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I find it especially admirable, the way she arranges everything practically. No waste, no excess, everything considered and in its correct place." She settled her knitting. "I have always felt that practicality, genuine practicality, is really the most admirable quality in a person. The ability to see clearly what needs doing, and to do it cleanly, without excessive complication, without unnecessary sentiment. Mrs. Plum looked at her. The robin eyes were very still. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple continued, in the same comfortable, unvarying tone, the tone she might have used to discuss the Women's Institute autumn program, or the varieties of apple currently in the orchard, about a hypothetical matter, purely theoretical. Suppose a man had in his possession, in his filing cabinets, in his private papers, documentation of a certain kind, letters, records, its evidence of a very old wrong. Suppose that wrong had involved a member of his own family, his father, let us say, and suppose that the documentation, if it became known, would be damaging. She took a sip of tea. Not legally, perhaps after so many years. The principles are long dead, and the law is less exercised by the dead than the living. But in other ways, socially, reputationally, the kind of damage that attaches itself to a family name and remains there, the way damp attaches itself to stone walls, invisible from the front, but very present to anyone who looks carefully. She set down her cup. A man with access to such documentation might use it, not overtly, not in any way that could be pointed to, but a certain look, a certain pausing, letting people know that he knows. Mrs. Plum sat with the stillness of a woman who has decided to sit still and is capable of maintaining that decision indefinitely. Someone who had watched him do this for 20 years, said Miss Marple, would understand his methods very precisely, would be able to describe them with great accuracy, would know his habits, when he arrived at his office, what he drank and when, which rooms he used alone, and which he used with others, and would have access, through the particular position they held in the village, to the details of his correspondence, the character of his incoming packages, the nature of his suppliers. She looked up from her knitting. "Your maiden name was Alderton, Mrs. Plum. Violet Alderton was your father's youngest sister." A silence, not a brief one. The fire spoke. The clock ticked. Outside, the October wind moved through the chestnut tree at the corner of the garden with a sound like dry paper. Mrs. Plum sat through all of it with perfect stillness. She was 17 years old, she said at last. The smooth social surface had not broken exactly. It had thinned, the way ice thins, until what was underneath showed through. Something very old and very hard. 17 years old, and she trusted him because he was the solicitor's son, and because he told her he intended to marry her. He was 23. He had a university education, and a future already arranged, and a father who would fix anything that needed fixing. His father arranged her removal. He paid my grandfather £40 and had her put on a train to Shropshire within a fortnight. £40 for a life. Her voice was absolutely level. My grandfather took it because he was a farmhand with 6 children and no legal recourse whatsoever against the most powerful family in the district. He took it, and he was ashamed of taking it for the rest of his life. Violet spent the rest of her life in Shropshire. She never came back. She died there in 1931, and I only met her twice as a child. But I knew the story. My father told me everything before he died. He gave me her letters to Mrs. Copley, copies he had made, because he thought someone should have them. And then Gerald Fossick, said Miss Marple gently. Gerald Fossick found his father's papers. A pause. Or perhaps he always knew. He was a boy of 12 in 1903, old enough to understand what a paid-off family meant. He grew up knowing, and when he became a solicitor and came back to the district, and established himself here, he found, or made, the position where that knowledge was most useful. "The Copley will," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Copley owned the building I lease. She had always intended to leave it to me. We had an understanding, a private understanding over 20 years. The post office has been my livelihood, my independence, the whole structure of my life. He knew that, and he changed her will in the final months when she was too tired and too ill to question him, and he removed that provision, and he transferred the building to his own management through mechanisms I cannot precisely identify or currently challenge. But you knew what he was going to do. I knew what he was going to do with the pharmaceutical supply," said Mrs. Plum, without any particular change of expression. "I read the label when it arrived. I noted the sender. I have a certain knowledge of such compounds from my years of handling medical correspondence in this village. I understood what it was, and what a man like Fossick, with his medical history and his precisely calibrated mind, might intend to do with it." Miss Marple said nothing. "He was going to use it on Cecily Marsh," said Mrs. Plum. "Not directly, not obviously. He intended to manage her, to make her ill gradually, in ways that would be attributed to her constitution. He had done something similar before, I believe, with a client whose affairs he wanted to control, a very old woman who had inexplicable episodes of weakness at precise intervals. Her hands were perfectly still in her lap. I have no proof of that. I only know what I know. So you reached the pantry first." "He was entirely predictable," said Mrs. Plum, with something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. "I knew where he would go and when, and I knew he would pour a glass from the pantry stock rather than the main table, because he did not like to be seen drinking repeatedly in public. He was vain about that sort of thing, vain about being perceived as temperate." A long silence. "Are you going to tell Inspector Mallory?" she asked. Not frightened, not pleading. A practical question from a practical woman. Miss Marple was quiet for some time. "I have written to Dr. Hargreaves," she said. "What he does with the letter is a matter for his professional judgment and his conscience. I cannot make that decision for him." She looked at Mrs. Plum steadily. "I will tell you this. A great wrong was done to your family. That is a fact, and it will remain a fact regardless of anything that follows. And Gerald Fossick was not a good man, which is also a fact." She paused. "But what was done in that pantry was murder, and that is a third fact. And facts, in my experience, are not easily managed regardless of how convenient their removal might be." Mrs. Plum looked at her for a long moment. "I know that," she said. "I have always known that. I simply concluded that the alternative was worse." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "That is usually how it begins." Chapter 8. After the autumn, Inspector Mallory of the County Constabulary was a large, cautious man of 50 who had worked in rural policing long enough to understand that villages are not simple places, and that what appears on the surface of them is rarely the most significant thing about them. He received Dr. Hargreaves's letter, forwarded with a covering note that indicated the doctor had spent an uncomfortable night before sending it, on the morning of October the 18th, and arrived in Much Benham before noon with a sergeant and an expression of contained displeasure. The pantry was examined. The cordial stores were examined. A sample from a remaining bottle, the one nearest the position where Fossick had been found, was sent for analysis. The glass, which had been anonymously and carefully preserved in a brown paper bag and left on Dr. Hargreaves's doorstep in the early hours of the morning, yielded traces of a compound consistent with a concentration of digitalis preparation several times the therapeutic dose. Mrs. Dorothea Plum was interviewed on October the 19th at the village hall, a choice of venue that was her own, Miss Marple noted, which was characteristic, and again on the 20th at the constabulary offices in Chadwick. She conducted both interviews with the same contained, thorough honesty with which she had conducted her conversation with Miss Marple, naming what she had done and why, making no attempt at evasion, and asking only once that the matter of her aunt be entered into the record in full. It was the letter, Violet Alderton's letter of 1903, written in fading brown ink on paper that had outlasted its writer by 32 years, was entered into evidence, and subsequently, at the conclusion of proceedings, returned to Cecily Marsh, who was its rightful owner in every sense that mattered. She took it to a solicitor in London in the 3rd week of November. The matter of Mrs. Copley's estate was opened for examination. It would take time. Legal matters always took time, but time, directed by the right instruments and the right intentions, is generally sufficient. Oliver Tash left Much Benham quietly on the morning of October the 19th, shortly before Inspector Mallory arrived for a second round of interviews. He sent no forwarding address. The documents he had been so anxious to recover from Fossick's files were eventually found and examined, and found to contain nothing more damaging than evidence of a private loan arrangement that had been made and had not, technically, been recorded in any way that bound Fossick's estate. He was, in the end, owed nothing legally, and knew it. Whether he had known what was coming, whether his confident, expansive presence at the harvest supper had been the performance of a man who understood that a particular conclusion was approaching and had arranged himself on the correct side of it. This was the question that Inspector Mallory could not satisfactorily resolve, and which Miss Marple turned over several times in her own mind without arriving at a verdict. He had known something. Whether that constituted knowledge in the legal sense was a question for other people to determine. Cecily Marsh remained in Much Benham. She did not need to stay, but she did, and Miss Marple thought she understood why. There is a particular kind of resolution that requires presence. The resolution of a place that has held a wrong for a very long time, and is slowly, in the way of villages, beginning to reckon with it. Cecily had her mother's name, both names, the real one, and a letter that told the truth, and a position in the village school that she had earned entirely on her own terms. These were not nothing. The post office was administered by a temporary postmistress, while the matter of its ownership was clarified. The village felt this acutely, and communicated the feeling to everyone who would listen, which was everyone. Miss Marple packed her bag on the morning of October the 21st. Euphemia came to help, and did not help, in the way that close friends do not help with packing, because they are otherwise occupied with saying goodbye. "It always feels," said Euphemia at the vicarage gate, standing with her coat incorrectly buttoned against the cold, as though things should be neater at the end, tidier. "They never are," said Miss Marple. "That is the nature of truth. It is almost always a little uneven, a little untrimmed at the edges, but it is there, and it persists. And eventually, though not always quickly and not always tidily, it does what it came to do. The motor arrived, and she settled herself in the back seat with her bag and her umbrella and her knitting, and, as the vehicle turned out of the vicarage lane onto the village road, she looked through the window at Much Benham in the October morning, the church tower, the chestnut tree, the post office with its closed blind, the school at the far end of the lane where, if she was not mistaken, a pale figure was crossing the yard toward the gate with the purposeful, straight-backed walk of someone who has somewhere to be and intends to get there. A quiet English village on a cold October morning, with its wood smoke and its old stone and its long memories, entirely ordinary on the surface of it, entirely unremarkable. The motor turned onto the Chadwick Road, and Much Benham disappeared behind the chestnut trees. Miss Marple looked at her knitting. The pale blue bed jacket was very nearly complete, perhaps another hour's work, and thought that she would have it finished well before Reading. She thought, too, about the village as it receded, about the particular patience of old wrongs, the way they waited in attics and filing cabinets and letters sealed with wax, waiting for the moment when someone with sufficient courage or sufficient fury or both opened the right drawer or the right door, and the thing that had been waiting all that time finally came out into the light. It was not a comfortable thought, but then truth, in Miss Marple's long experience, was not primarily comfortable. It was primarily necessary, and necessity, she had found, had a way of managing itself in the end, regardless of how many pantry doors were locked against it. The halt appeared ahead. The train was already in. She was not, for once, going to be late. The end. An autumn evening in Much Benham. A Miss Marple fan. Fiction original story inspired by the works of Dame Agatha Christie.